Hello and welcome to this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. I'm Moses Brattrud. We're so happy you're with us today, and I'm joined with Becca Delahunt. I'm joined by Becca Delahunt, our Director of Public Policy, because today we're discussing a couple things, but one thing that we're talking about is a bill that passed on Monday, which if it were passed by the Senate and signed by the governor, would legalize commercial surrogacy in Minnesota. And that's something we have really strong concerns about. So Becca is here for a brief time before she goes back to keep meeting with legislators on this and other issues. And before I am back with Grace to talk about a couple other things. But I'm here with Becca to ask about more about this bill, because I think this is certainly something that I and probably a lot of people don't have a huge level of familiarity with. So what are we talking about when we're talking about commercial surrogacy, and what has the Minnesota House recently done?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, surrogacy is a confusing issue for a lot of us. It's complicated and there's a lot of parties involved, and so there's many variables. So I thought maybe I would just start out by giving a brief explanation of what surrogacy is.
Yeah.
So surrogacy creates an embryo, a child, by taking together sperm and egg and creating a child through IVF, and then implanting that child into the womb of what's commonly called the surrogate mother, or the more dehumanizing phrase, gestational carrier. And then she births the child to the intended parent or intended parents. So there's so many concerns with that, Moses. I would say chiefly, you can see that the main concern is that any intended parent who wants to have a child can procure a child through this process. And this doesn't take into account that child's needs. I mean, think about all the development that goes into the early stages of a child's life and how much they depend on the only woman that they know, right? In this case would be the surrogate mother. But this is creation of children with the intention of separating them from their parents, taking that traditional role of mother, the role of motherhood, and splitting it into three women, and really confusing that child as to their identity. There are so many things I could get into. I'm sure a lot of women who are listening who've had children know, because this baby will be foreign material to the woman's body, her body will naturally try to reject this baby. And so she needs to be injected with lots of hormones to try to keep the baby. There's many risks and complications. We can maybe link a study that can get into more detail on the various complications that come from these types of pregnancies, and they're high risk inherently. And so you're putting this child at risk for the sake of often unrelated adults. And we can get into the specifics of the Minnesota bill. But yeah, the main concern I would say is from the perspective of the child, but then also the fact that we're dehumanizing women in this way. And in the case of the Minnesota bill, legalizing for-profit surrogacy. So it's one thing to have a woman who's willing to carry a child maybe for a sister, and there are ethical considerations with that too, but for the sake of time, we'll focus on the Minnesota bill specifically. Paying a woman, paying for her organs, right, to carry a child, we would never do that for organ donation, of course, is very unethical and just treats her as a carrier. So I wanted to get into the specifics of the Minnesota bill. Moses. So with the Minnesota bill, there is no limitation on the number of embryos that will be created. And right now in America, there are somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million embryos frozen in storage. And there's a variety of age ranges for how long those embryos have been in storage. Fertility clinics will sift through the embryos that are created and then pick which ones they think are deemed most viable to continue and result in the birth of a child. And often what goes into this process is really, sadly, eugenic selection. So you have the parents say, we only want a girl. We want her to have these features. There's genetic testing often of the embryos that are created. And if the fertility clinic deems, this embryo to have a better genetic makeup than maybe this one that could have an abnormality, those are donated to research. They're, discarded as medical waste, or they're frozen for future use. Often is the way this is done. And so this particular bill allows for unlimited embryo creation. It also allows, again, like I said, for paid surrogacy. And there's a lot of concerns with that. If you look this up globally, there are many concerns in Europe. The EU has actually, I believe, banned for-profit surrogacy generally, and for-profit surrogacy certainly. There's lots of quotes from the Prime Minister of Italy, particularly talking about the unethical nature of paying women for renting their wombs, and the dehumanization of that and the power dynamic that creates, right? The intended parents are just using her for a means to an end. And in effect, this is really no different than buying a child. Also, people might be shocked to know that there's no background check required in the Minnesota language. And so when you think about the adoption process, you have intended parents. I shouldn't even use the surrogacy language, intended parents. You have people looking to see if they can rescue a child from a really sad situation where the child is waiting to be rescued, which is in contrast to surrogacy, where there's no background check. There's no extensive, home study and making sure that the parents are safe and that they're raising any other children well. In this particular bill, there's no requirement for a background check, which is just wild. So anybody who has money and means can buy a child in essence. And frankly, that's basically human trafficking. This is contract law. So this is in essence human trafficking. And it's wild that this is touted as progressive in 2024.
So that was significantly worse than I expected.
Right.
Because I really did not know a ton about this. And I assume that many people watching and listening also were in ignorance that the Minnesota House did this. So they passed this on Monday.
The House passes on Monday, yes.
So what's the next step?
Right. So the next step will be to get it passed in the Senate for the bill proponents. And I believe there's going to be more difficulty passing it in the Senate. And so we're lobbying pretty hard on that end. Remember that the Democratic majority only has 1 seat majority in the Senate, and there are some concerns about this language. We're monitoring that and we're lobbying against it, and we will continue to work on that. But we're hoping that we can stop it at least for this year until the surrogacy agencies come back and want the legal framework to enforce their contracts and to make money off of women again. So
that is so just mind-boggling to me. And I think, people have this sense that I have a right to be a parent.
Right.
If I am infertile or if I'm in a relationship that can't naturally produce children, then I must have a right to obtain children by other means. And IVF is an option that is, let's just say that it's less problematic than the surrogacy, where you're completely unrelated to the IVF is involved in surrogacy, as you said. And I just think of all the kids languishing in the adoption system.
Right.
And I also think that I think of I talked with someone recently who was unable to adopt because of a heart condition. And I don't think, because you have to their actuarial tables, if you're going to get legal custody of this child, you need to be, apparently I just learned this, you need to have the expectation that you're going to live throughout that child's, childhood. Right. And that's seems good. Right. And yet I think it sounds like these surrogate parents are coming in, they're waving a fistful of dollars,
right,
and then they don't have any of those requirements.
Right.
Especially, it's just, that is just insane to me. And I just think it reminds me of the movie, I think it's called Gattaca. In the beginning of the movie Gattaca, there's this scene where these parents are in a doctor's office, and the doctor is asking them, what attributes do you want your child to have?
Right. Yeah.
The designer embryo that you mentioned. And that is just so dehumanizing.
It is. And I want to clarify first that any child born of surrogacy obviously is fully human and deserves all the rights that any other child does. But I think, Moses, you brought up a great point. we want to be sensitive to the fact that so many people sadly struggle with infertility, people really close to me actually, and we pray regularly actually for God to grant them more children. But when we look at this issue of justice for our state, if there's no background checks on this, we have to be able to say not every adult can get a child, right? I mean, if you Google, there are many instances that I've seen, Moses, where people find out later that someone who's not safe for children was able to use the surrogacy process to procure a child. And then we find out that maybe they have a, criminal sex history in the past, and now they have the child, but they, held the terms of the contract. And so there's not much we can do about it unless there's a crime found later. So we have to take those things into consideration when we're looking at surrogacy law. There's really a dark underbelly. So we're lobbying to stop it, to make it not pass in the Senate, and continue to speak out for these children who can't speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And these women as well, who are being exploited in many cases. You do hear happy stories of surrogacy where it works out for the people involved, but there are a lot of stories globally of women being exploited and commercial surrogacy being shut down because you find out that all of these women are being exploited.
Right. I want to say one thing, and I'll ask you one more question. We're in a situation since the last time we filmed this podcast where any bill that is going to go through the Minnesota Senate on a party line vote will have to go through with the vote of a senator, Senator Mitchell from Woodbury, who has been charged with burglary.
Right.
And that's a situation we probably, most people listening to this are probably familiar with that. They heard it because it made national headlines. A state senator charged with dressing up in black and entering her stepmother's house at 4:45 a.m. And
Right.
It's a crazy story, if that's what happened. And so if people who support surrogacy want to push this bill through the legislature, it sounds to me like they're going to have to utilize this senator who is, has been charged with this felony to do that, which is just crazy to me. And that, I think, segues to some of the other bills that we're concerned about throughout the next 2.5 weeks, and then the session will be over. So it's a busy time for you, I'm sure, and for Renee and for the legislators. Can you tell me what, other than the surrogacy bill, what's the biggest concern that you have through this last period of the legislature, and what can people do?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, a big concern that we've been talking about, we talked here on the podcast and in lots of our communications, is the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is the proposed amendment to our state constitution that would guarantee equal rights on the basis of so-called gender and gender expression. There are many concerns with the current Equal Rights Amendment. You may have heard of the ERA from decades ago. It was really focused on women's issues at that time. And now Moses, the primary focus of it is to protect rights of those who maybe choose to identify with a gender that does not reflect their sex, right? And so the concern with an Equal Rights Amendment from the gender perspective would be that we could have males taking advantage of this system and bringing harm to women and children. So everything that you're seeing in the news, from males being in women's sports to males using female facilities, claiming to be a woman, males using women's domestic abuse shelters and getting access to restrooms, locker rooms, etc., and taking priority. For those who don't know, there are 2 males housed in Shakopee Women's Prison right now. One of them is a convicted murderer who's serving for life. So that just kind of puts into perspective the cultural changes. Moses, I believe that's been slowed down because there are concerns about lack of protections for religious freedom in multiple bills moving through the legislature right now. And the most updated proposed language for the ERA does not include any protections for religious freedom. And that's causing some bad PR for the majority. And so the movement on that has slowed down. We are lobbying on it still and expecting to see it at some point, lobbying as if it is going to come up, planning for it to come up this year and preparing members. It has passed the Minnesota Senate last year, and so it only has to pass the House. And proposed amendments are different than normal bills because the governor does not have to sign them into law. They go straight to our ballot. So we could be voting on an equal rights amendment either this fall or maybe fall 2026. So we're working on that as well. And that would be pretty substantial, Moses. I also should mention, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that sex has been, equal rights on the basis of sex has been interpreted to mean constitutional right to abortion in other cases. And so it touches on our issues of abortion, this issue of gender identity, and religious freedom. So that really encompasses our whole mission, right?
Yes. So if that amendment were to pass both houses, we would have a real fight on our hands. And
Right.
of course, that is what we're working to avoid by hoping to kill this in the legislature through Becca's efforts. I will say that we have sent out action alerts so that you can send messages to your legislators about this issue. And we're going to send out another one shortly because we feel certain that legislators need to hear again that this bill is wrong for Minnesota. None of the proposed language would be a step forward for women, which is
Right.
what it's claimed.
Right.
And it would be significant steps backward for religious freedom and for the protection of life, among other things in our state.
Right.
So I want to say thank you to Becca so much
Thank you for having me.
for joining us this morning. I'll be back with Grace in a few moments. And thank you so much for tuning into the Family Beacon.
Moses, that was such a great conversation between you and Becca. I'm so glad she was able to join us on the podcast and break down those really important bills and give an update to our audience. So I did want to, as our final segment of the podcast, kind of just share some highlights from our annual dinner, which was last Friday. Again, we had Seth Dillon as our keynote speaker, and wow, it was such a great night. It was my favorite dinner that I've ever been to for MFC. I think I've been to maybe like 6 or 7 at this point. Hands down my favorite. I'll be interested to see if it was yours too. But I wanted to share a few of my highlights and then maybe get a few of your highlights, Moses, if there were some things that stood out to you as really excellent. For me, a highlight was absolutely Seth Dillon. He was just super funny. He was funnier than I even thought he would be. He had the room engaged the entire time, which is really a feat for a keynote speaker, especially when you're speaking for about 30 minutes. So he did great, cracked a lot of jokes, but he also was able to get some serious points across, even though he was a hilarious keynote. I also would say a highlight for me was our CEO, Jeff Evans, his mission/vision speech, which was before Seth gave his speech, was so well done. He had some really good zingers in there. So I want to see if I can pull some of his best lines for our social media. So make sure you guys follow us over on all platforms at MN Family Council. I'm going to pull some of those clips in the coming weeks because he just laid everything out so amazingly. And I think it tied in really well with what Seth was saying, because Seth kind of brought the jovial bent to it. And Jeff is a pretty funny guy too, but he brought kind of more of the seriousness. Here's why we're fighting against all of these things. And then Seth kind of came up and said, and here's how we can use humor to do so. So overall, the flow of the night was awesome. I also loved emceeing the event. It was my first time emceeing an event, and I had a blast. It was just such a fun night. The energy in the room was great. I'll say one more highlight for me, Moses, was that we had mocktails, and we've never had those before. My vote for next year will be cocktails, but for mocktails, those are the best mocktails I've ever had. We had some pretty funny names. One of them was called the Pouty Progressive, and one was the Cranky Conservative, which kind of ties into our theme of Rulers Rage, God Laughs. Not only are we laughing at our opposition, which is progressive ideology, but we're also laughing at ourselves, and especially people that are cranky, that ideologically are on our side, but they don't have that joyful attitude that we're called to have as Christians. So the drinks were not only named well, but they were also just tasted delicious and were so fun. So those were a lot of my highlights, Moses. I'm interested in yours, and then I'm also hoping you can tell our audience about our matching challenge that our supporters can help us meet.
Absolutely. And I would agree with all of your highlights. I think a highlight for me was that you did such a great job on stage. I think you really energized the room. And I think people really connected with that. And as you say, Jeff did a great job and Seth did a great job. I really thought our videos turned out well, and we will
Yeah.
make sure to share those with folks. In fact, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll make sure those are in the video description, and we'll share those in our email newsletter that goes out. And we had 3 videos: one about MFC as a whole, one about the Church Ambassador Network, and one about True North Legal, our legal initiative. So those are, I think they all turn out great.
Yeah.
Watching all of them will take you less than 15 minutes, and you'll get a really good sense of what our mission is, who we are. You'll see our smiling faces, and as well as Renee, Jeff, our pastors, and get a sense of who we are and what we do. So I am very excited. We received our largest ever matching challenge. So a generous donor committed $200,000 in funding,
Amazing.
which is amazing. And when I started working here, I didn't understand quite what that meant. So I'll just really simply say, what that means is if we raise $200,000, the donor will then give us $200,000. So it's a total gift of $400,000, and that would go a huge way towards us fulfilling our mission this year. And I'll share more about that in a second. And if we don't get all the way to 200,000, then we won't unlock all those funds. So it is a time where we need everyone to partner with us. So we have raised, in round numbers, from the dinner and from other emails, about 150,000. So that means we need 50,000 more to unlock that full $400,000 amount, which will go so far towards our mission. I want to talk about what are we going to do if and when we unlock that matching challenge. So there's a couple goals that Jeff set forth on Friday for our donors, and he really knocked it out of the park, as Grace said. And there's a couple things we want to do. We want to grow our legal team at True North Legal. The demand is way greater than what we can currently cover with just one attorney, Renee. Renee is so competent that people are coming to her from all over the state, and indeed from all over the nation, asking her to participate on amicus briefs, to advise the justices of the Supreme Court, to defend our rights right here in Minnesota, which is always the focus. And so we need to grow that team. We also need to expand the reach of the Church Ambassador Network. The goal is that every faithful, gospel-believing church in Minnesota would send their pastor with us to St. Paul. This morning, I prayed with and sang with a pastor who's here in town from near Rochester. And I don't think he's been up here before. And he's going to meet with his legislators. And I hope that he and all of you will spread the word to your church, your pastor, and other churches that you know. We will also need to be working strategically this fall. We need to win about 4 seats in the Minnesota House to take back the Minnesota House, to ensure that we have a pro-life majority in the Minnesota House. Grace, does that sound like a big number?
It sounds like a big number.
No, it is not a big number.
No, but it sounds like a big number is what I'm trying to say.
No, 4, just 4. We just need 4
Sorry,
seats.
I missed that you said 4. I thought you said we need a pro-life majority in the House, and you just stopped there. And I was like, yeah, it sounds like a big number, but little do our people know, you'd already announced the number. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Maybe there was an audio delay here, but yeah, we need 4 seats to regain that pro-life majority, and that's not a big number. So we need to be engaged, Grace, in these key districts as we get towards the election, and that is one of the things we will be doing with your gifts. So
Absolutely.
I would ask that you would partner with us. Remember, there are 2 ways that you can support our work. One is a tax-deductible gift to Minnesota Family Institute. So if you itemize your tax deductions, that's the route you'll want to go. And that supports our work, because we're 2 organizations with one mission. Minnesota Family Council is not a tax-deductible gift, and that donation can be used more towards lobbying and elections efforts. So we're so grateful for your partnership and support, and we ask that you help us help us meet that match. Remember, your gift will be doubled by a generous donor. So if you give $100, that will be doubled. It's $200. It's magic how that works. One other point about I wanted to make: we are considering. We've had some interest in seeing the recording of the dinner for people who were not able to attend our sold out event, and we're talking about making that recording available to people who make a donation of a certain amount. So that has not been finalized yet. But if you make a donation and you're interested in seeing the recording, just get in touch with me and we will make that happen. Grace, we've been off for a couple of weeks. For the dinner, I think it's been at least 3 weeks since we were on the podcast, so it's good to be back. And I did want to ask you, what have you been reading?
Yeah, I'm glad we get to do that little segment in this episode. I have definitely missed it, and I've been reading a lot. One book that I'm almost finished with is called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. You probably heard of it. It's a very famous marketing book. Have you read it?
Yeah, I have, yes.
Did you enjoy it?
I did.
Yeah, it's been pretty good. I will say my favorite chapters were definitely like the first two. Those were very informative. There's a lot of good nuggets in it, but mainly the book speaks on how you can create a position in a prospective customer's mind, one that reflects the company's strengths and weaknesses as well as those of its competitors. And so it's been very interesting, especially thinking how to apply it to a nonprofit. So where we don't sell products. Instead, we're trying to get people on board with our mission and to get active in their communities. So yeah, that's been really interesting. Surprise, surprise. I'm also reading fiction. Moses likes to tease me that I only read children's lit. That is like 80% true. I'm actually rereading the Percy Jackson series, which is just like, I'm listening to them. Yeah. That's just because I just moved recently. And so as I unpack, it's kind of just an easy book. I don't really have to pay super close attention to. So yeah, in between as I'm unpacking boxes and stuff at night, I just kind of turn that on. But have you read that series?
No, I never have. I gather the kind of like the Greek mythology thing vibe, and that's really all I know about it.
Exactly. It's definitely more middle grade fiction. They're funny and interesting. And I think it does a good job of introducing younger kids to Greek mythology, like you say. So yeah, reading that series. And then I'm also currently reading Christian Reflections by C.S. Lewis, which is a collection of essays that Lewis wrote. So those are very good. Moses, what are you reading?
I have been also busy with lots of books, and I just looking at Goodreads, and mostly since the last time we filmed, I've been reading the Patrick O'Brien series, which starts with Master and Commander, which was made into a really great movie in, I think, 2003. There was just one movie, but there are 20 books, and I am on book number 10. Wow. And so these are it's historical fiction. Almost everything takes place on a ship or on different ships during the Napoleonic Wars. So it starts around 1802, and I think right now I'm up to 1812, 1813 in the war. And they are just it is impossible to describe how satisfying they are. They are because it's historical fiction, which some people would look down on. But I think that the characters are so well developed. And after 10 books, the author has had so much time and space to develop their characters, develop the friendship between the two main characters, the captain of the ship, Captain Aubrey, and the surgeon, Stephen Maturin. And it's just... words fail. I can't. Sometimes I wake up thinking about these books because I've been reading them so much and just thinking about them. And I will say also, and I might have said this in a previous episode, but watch the movie Master and Commander. It is my favorite movie of all time. If you haven't seen it, if you watch it, you'll understand a little bit more about me. Two other books.
That's a good recommendation. I'm gonna have to watch that movie tonight.
Have you not?
No,
I've
seen it. I just haven't seen it in years.
Okay.
So I feel like I need to watch it again, and then maybe I'll read the books because you're giving them a really raving review. So I got to check them out.
Oh, I'll tell you more offline. I mean, honestly, I think you would love them. But yeah, you and your husband should put on the movie because it really has aged well. And if you go on, I'll be done soon, I promise. But if you go on YouTube, you look at like channels that talk about movies, and especially channels that talk about historical movies, they will all agree that Master and Commander is one of the few historical movies that really gets it right. And that's partly because the subject matter is there's so much attention to detail in the way they talk, the way their appearance, what they eat. All of these things are incredibly authentic to how they would have been 200 years ago.
Awesome.
2 more books that I have gone through. I read The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, which was kind of interesting. I think there were upsides and downsides to that. The last part of it is really good. I think it would have been better if C.S. Lewis really accepted the accuracy of the Genesis account and didn't try to explain it with some very inventive but kind of weird allegories for, Adam and Eve not literally existing, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
So that was a little disappointing. I also just finished a book, and I haven't really made up my mind about this book, but there's a guy called Patrick Deneen. He's a professor at Notre Dame. A few years ago, he wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed. That attracted a lot of attention. Barack Obama even read it and recommended it. But this guy's a conservative Christian. And so he wrote a new one called Regime Change Towards a Post-Liberal Future. And I have to say, first impression, it was kind of a mixed bag. There wasn't much that I think was, there was a lot of interesting stuff, but not, I think, useful for Christians who really want to rebuild our country as a faithful place. It was a little bit more of a, this is why everything is bad. It was more negative than positive, if that makes sense. So that was a bit of a longer update on my books because we haven't done this in a while. So give me a little slack. And I will now ask Grace, as we do every episode, would you tell us about a verse or a passage from the Bible that you think we would profit from?
Absolutely. Well, I really wanted to tie in our ending to our dinner theme. I can't remember if we've shared this verse on the podcast before, but this comes from Psalm 2. It was kind of like our theme verses for our dinner. And it reads, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury." That's from Psalm 2, verses 1 to 6. And it's just so good. Becca was telling you guys earlier about a lot of the ways in which wicked rulers are raging against the Lord right now in our capital. And it's a good reminder that the Lord will terrify them with his fury. He will put their wicked plots to an end. And again, this is the theme of our dinner. And it's just a timely reminder for us to take courage, to keep the long game in mind, and to never stop being faithful, because that's what God calls us to. So with that, let's close out the podcast episode. It's been a great episode. It's great to be back. We will see you guys next Friday.